happens when a $100,000 drone swarm threatens a $7 billion fortress of steel, fire, and oil? On September 5, 2025, that question was no longer hypothetical. At exactly 02:00 hours, the quiet hum of machines at the Ryazan refinery, Russia's most valuable energy facility, was about to be shattered by one of the most audacious Ukrainian strikes of the war. For 3 months, Ukrainian planners had studied every pipe radar coverage zone and patrol cycle, orchestrating an operation that would not only cripple a refinery, but also deliver a psychological blow to Moscow's claim of invulnerability. The refinery itself was not just another industrial asset. Western analysts, such as those at Defense News and BBC Monitoring, have long described Ryazan as the crown jewel of Russia's domestic energy network. It fuels Moscow's military district supplies the capital's civilian economy and funnels billions of rubles into the Kremlin's treasury. To strike here was to pierce the financial heart of Russia's war machine. NATO intelligence officers privately suggested that disabling Ryazan, even temporarily, could achieve more than a dozen victories on the front lines. And for Ukraine, the cost of the attempt would be minuscule in comparison. The weapon of choice was the Sokil 300 mothership drone, a sleek terrain-hugging machine that could fly at 150 miles per hour just 130 feet above ground. Strapped to its fuselage were 10 FPV drones, each carrying a 4.4-pound shaped charge warhead designed to melt steel and ignite crude oil. The total cost, about $150,000 for the entire package. The potential return billions in destruction and a direct blow to Russia's energy exports. Western military economist Marcus Walker noted in the Financial Times that this kind of cost-to-damage ratio represents a new frontier in asymmetric warfare, where garage-built tech defeats state-of-the-art defenses. But the real story began long before the drones lifted off from a concealed site in Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. For weeks, Ukrainian intelligence had mapped every weakness of the refinery. U.S. satellites provided static overhead images, while locally deployed Lelika 100 scout drones collected live data on radar sweeps and flight paths of Russian Mi-28 attack helicopters. This was not brute force. It was corporate-style targeting of a single point of failure, the Ilyu AVT-6 cracking unit, worth nearly $500 million. A refinery worth $7 billion could be hobbled by destroying just one critical system inside it. Reports from Reuters confirmed that this was part of a broader Ukrainian strategy throughout 2025 targeting Russia's critical energy hubs to force the Kremlin to spend money on defense instead of frontline reinforcements. In August alone, Ukraine had launched coordinated drone raids on oil depots in Krasnodar and fuel storage sites in Tatarstan, forcing Moscow to divert precious air defense assets. By striking, Ryazan Kyiv was escalating the campaign to its most daring level yet. At the operational level, the strategy was simple, but brilliant. Rather than sending dozens of smaller drones that could be picked off by long-range systems like the S-400, Ukraine chose one mothership to fly low and undetected, releasing its payload only when inside striking distance. A Ukrainian defense official quoted by Al Jazeera explained, "The Russians look up to the sky expecting a wave. We slip under their radar with a knife." This was not about overwhelming numbers. It was about precision and deception. Russia, for its part, believed Ryazan untouchable. The facility was wrapped in concentric circles of defense worth billions, the S-400 Triumph system for high-altitude threats. Krasuka 4 electronic jammers blanketing 150 miles in RF noise and Pantsir S-1 systems positioned to shred anything within range. Add to that patrol helicopters and Spetsnaz teams, and Moscow boasted of a fortress against aerial threats. Yet as DW analysts highlighted earlier this year, these very defenses were optimized for large, expensive aircraft and missiles. not for swarms of cheap, agile drones skimming treetops. And while Moscow was confident, NATO was watching closely. The Trump administration, according to the New York Times, had quietly expanded intelligence-sharing agreements with Kyiv, providing enhanced real-time data from Western satellites and AWACS surveillance aircraft stationed over Poland. Officially, Washington maintained a hands-off posture, but the fingerprints of NATO's intelligence support were unmistakable in the precision of Ukrainian drone paths. Inside the refinery, operators like Sergei, the man monitoring radar feeds that night, had grown complacent. For over a year, he had watched reports of drone strikes elsewhere and dismissed them as children's toys. Now unknown to him, 10 of those toys were less than 20 minutes away, their paths carefully plotted to exploit blind spots in his billion-dollar shield. This was more than a tactical gamble. It was a statement that the future of war is not about the size of your arsenal, but the sharpness of your strategy. If Ukraine succeeded, it would showcase a blueprint for smaller nations facing powerful adversaries, bypass the front line, strike the economic heart, and turn the war machine against itself. Yet success was not guaranteed. The Sokol 300 still had to cross hundreds of kilometers of contested airspace, relying on a mix of Western intelligence and Ukrainian ingenuity to slip through. The jamming pod carried by one FPV drone was untested in live combat. And even if they reached the perimeter, the fortress of Ryazan still bristled with missile systems waiting to fire. Would Ukraine's $150,000 gamble rewrite the playbook of modern warfare, or end as another failed experiment in asymmetric tactics? Question for viewers. If you were in Kyiv's war room, would you have risked so many resources on a single high-value strike, or spread them across multiple smaller targets? The Sokol 300 was already airborne, and within minutes the Ryazan refinery's billion-dollar defenses would face their ultimate test. At 00:15 hours, the Sokol 300 drone rose silently from a makeshift launch site in Ukraine's Sumy Oblast, its wings loaded with 10 FPV children. For the next 90 minutes, it would skim treetops, weaving through valleys, hugging rivers, and hiding within the Earth's curvature. The mothership's mission was clear: get within 12 miles of the Ryazan refinery and release its deadly swarm. For Ukrainian operators, this was the culmination of months of planning. For Moscow, it would be the first sign that its billion-dollar fortress was more vulnerable than it ever imagined. The Sokol 300 was not a hobbyist drone. With a cruising speed of 150 miles per hour and a low-altitude flight ceiling of just 130 feet, it was designed for stealth and survivability. Its payload of FPV drones was both cheap and lethal. Each warhead could vaporize steel and ignite crude oil tanks. Western analysts compared the Sokol's mission profile to the American MQ-9 Reaper's swarm deployment concepts, though at a fraction of the cost. As Defense News reported in early September 2025, Ukraine's Sokol was a poor man's bomber with the effect of a strategic weapon. Its flight path was not a straight line. Every twist and curve had been meticulously charted by months of intelligence gathering. U.S. satellites gave Kyiv static maps of radar coverage, but Ukrainian Lelika 100 scouts filled in the gaps with real-time data. Together they painted an invisible highway through Russian defenses. As BBC analysts noted, the brilliance of this operation lies not in the drone itself, but in the marriage of intelligence and improvisation. The decision to use a single mothership was controversial. Some Ukrainian commanders argued for multiple long-range drones to saturate defenses, but the planners insisted that one stealthier craft could deliver the knockout blow. A senior Ukrainian officer quoted by Reuters compared it to hunting fire arrows from a mile away, when you can walk up quietly and strike the heart. The strategy was high risk, but potentially decisive. By 01:30 hours, the Sokol 300 was closing on Ryazan. Its operators monitored every data feed, knowing one miscalculation could expose the craft to Russia's Nebo M, or Big Bird radars. These long-range systems were designed to detect strategic bombers and ballistic missiles at 250 miles. But the Sokil flew too low, hiding in ground clutter. It was like searching for a needle with a telescope. Inside the refinery's command center, the situation appeared calm. Screens showed empty skies. Radar feeds were clean, and operators like Sergei saw no reason for alarm. Russian state media in recent weeks had boasted that no drone could penetrate Ryazan's defenses. The refinery was guarded by S-400 Triumph missile systems, Pantsir S-1 complexes, and the Krasuka-4 electronic jammer capable of blanketing 150 miles with raw RF energy. Add to that 2 Mi-28 Havoc helicopters on permanent standby, and Moscow was convinced nothing could get close. Yet this very overconfidence was the weakness Ukraine aimed to exploit. By focusing on long-range, high-value defenses, Russia had ignored the threat of small, cheap drones. A DW military analyst called it the Maginot Line problem: fortify against yesterday's war only to be blindsided by today's innovation. At Air 158 hours, the Sokil reached its kill zone 12 miles from the refinery. This was the precise distance calculated to avoid Pantsir S-1 interceptors, while still within striking range. Then, in a maneuver as dramatic as it was final, the Sokil opened its bay and released all 10 FPVs into the night sky. Among them was one drone unlike the others. Instead of a warhead, it carried a custom-built electronic jamming pod. Its sole mission to unleash a 10-second blast of microwave energy aimed directly at the S-400's radar, creating a temporary blind spot. Ukrainian engineers described it as throwing sand in the goalie's eyes right before the penalty shot. The timing had to be perfect. To trigger the radar, 2 FPVs shot upward, deliberately exposing themselves to detection. On Russian screens, 2 bright blips suddenly appeared. The S-400 locked on instantly, ready to engage. That was the cue. The jammer drone activated, flooding the radar with high-powered interference. For 10 seconds, the billion-dollar defense system was blind. In that fleeting window, the remaining 7 FPVs slipped through hugging terrain and navigating without GPS. The Krasuka-4 had already jammed satellite signals across the region, but Ukrainian drones were prepared. They relied on inertial navigation, solid-state gyros, and accelerometers that tracked every tilt, every turn, every acceleration. As one Western engineer told the New York Times, "You can jam a signal, but you can't fool physics." Meanwhile, NATO was watching. U.S. AWACS aircraft flying over Poland tracked the developing strike. According to Al Jazeera's defense desk, Western intelligence had a vested interest in monitoring how Russian defenses responded. Every radar activation, every missile launch, every jammer burst provided valuable electronic intelligence that NATO analysts could dissect for future contingencies. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S. had tightened conditions on direct involvement, but intelligence sharing with Kyiv was as robust as ever. For Ukraine, the mission was already halfway successful. The Sokil had delivered its children and was now banking hard for home. Its final command was pre-programmed to dive into a remote forest to ensure no technology fell into Russian hands. What remained was the swarm's fight against Ryazan's fortress. Would the 7 attackers navigate the last 12 miles and strike the refinery's Achilles heel? Or would Russia's billion-dollar security blanket finally awaken and crush them? At 01:59 hours, the quiet night sky above Ryazan erupted into chaos. 2 FPV drones climbed sharply, deliberately, sacrificing themselves to trigger Russia's most prized weapon, the S-400 Triumph. On Russian command screens, the blips appeared like ghosts out of nowhere, drawing the full attention of operators who had been lulled into complacency. Within seconds, the system did what its half-billion-dollar price tag promised. It locked on acquiring the targets with ruthless efficiency. But as the S-400 prepared to fire, the Ukrainian Joker revealed its hand. The specially modified jammer drone unleashed its payload, a concentrated microwave burst aimed directly at the radar's receiver. It was, as one NATO electronic warfare officer later described to Defense News, the equivalent of blinding a sniper with a flashlight beam. For 10 seconds, the gravestone radar, the eyes of Russia's most expensive defense, was rendered useless. In that manufactured window of blindness, the real attackers slipped through. 7 FPVs hugging the treetops and darting between radar shadows advanced toward the refinery perimeter. Unlike commercial drones, they weren't dependent on GPS. Russian Krasuka-4 jammers blanketed the area in overwhelming radio interference, but the Ukrainians had anticipated this. Each FPV carried an inertial navigation system that tracked velocity, tilt, and turn by physics alone. "You can spoof satellites," remarked an American engineer quoted by Reuters, "but you can't rewrite Newton's laws." Inside the refinery, the illusion of calm shattered. Warning sirens blared as radar operators, realizing they had been duped, scrambled to reactivate systems. Russian Ministry of Defense officials would later claim that their defenses had destroyed 92 incoming drones across the country, 8 of them allegedly at Ryazan. Independent analysis, however, painted a different picture. The strike wasn't a chaotic swarm. It was a scalpel cutting directly toward one of Russia's most critical energy nodes. As the drones closed in the outer electronic wall surged to life. The Krasuka-4 doubled its emissions, flooding the spectrum with so much noise that civilian cell service across 2 oblasts failed. 2 Mi-28 Havoc helicopters stationed nearby roared into the air, their optics scanning for the telltale flicker of drone propellers. Meanwhile, the Pantsir S-1 batteries, the final guardians, sprang awake. Each $15 million system carried a combination of missiles and 30mm cannons optimized for shredding anything within a few kilometers. But no system performs perfectly under panic. Pantsir operators, now facing multiple fast-moving blips closing at low altitude, switched to manual engagement. Streams of tracers and missile launches lit up the night. The scene resembled a fire hose trying to catch hummingbirds. Inevitably, some drones were caught. One FPV was shredded by tungsten fragments from a proximity-fused missile. Another, its propellers severed, spun into a flaming crash. A third drone was ripped apart by a burst of cannon fire, yet the chaos favored the attackers. Smoke explosions and RF interference created a battlefield where agility mattered more than cost. One crippled drone, its camera feed flickering, was steered deliberately into a pool of spilled fuel, igniting a fire that cascaded toward storage tanks. It was, in the words of a Western analyst speaking to The Guardian, a kamikaze within a kamikaze, turning failure into fuel. The Russians responded with brute force. The S-400 recovered from its jamming window and fired 2 missiles, obliterating the decoys. Pantsir crews expended missile after missile, their ready-to-fire racks emptying in frantic salvos. Helicopters strafed through the smoke, their optics barely cutting through the heat haze. By the end of the engagement, 8 of Ukraine's 10 drones were reduced to twisted wreckage across the Ryazan countryside, but 2 remained. These last FPVs, weaving through smoke and shrapnel, slipped inside the defensive perimeter. Their operators, watching through grainy first-person feeds, now had the refinery's heart in sight. The Ilyusv-AVT-6 cracking unit, a $500 million industrial nerve center, and the massive crude oil storage tank adjacent to it loomed ahead. The choice was brutal, but clear: strike the brain or the heart. Meanwhile, NATO observers in Poland and the Baltic states were monitoring every moment. According to BBC's security desk, Western analysts were less concerned with the drone's survival than with the electronic signatures of Russia's response. Every missile fired, every jammer activated, every radar sweep. This was data NATO could dissect for its own contingencies against Moscow. Under President Trump's administration, official statements refrained from confirming direct assistance. But insiders suggested that NATO had gained more electronic intelligence from Ryazan in one night than in the past 6 months combined. For Moscow, however, the situation was no longer academic. Flames were licking storage pipes, comms were breaking under electronic strain, and commanders were realizing their billion-dollar defense had been manipulated by a handful of cheap drones. The psychology of the moment was as damaging as the physical attack. As one DW analyst later noted, it wasn't just steel that burned at Ryazan. It was the illusion of invulnerability. 2 drones, 2 operators, 1 refinery worth $7 billion. At 02:03 hours, the final act began. Through smoke tracer fire and the wreckage of their fallen comrades, 2 Ukrainian FPVs broke free into the open. Their operators watching through live feeds could now see the refinery's vital core, the Ilyusavt-6 cracking unit, and the adjacent crude oil storage tank. Both targets represented billions in economic value, and the choice was brutal: strike the brain or the heart of Russia's energy system. But in this case, Ukraine didn't have to choose. With 2 drones remaining, each operator committed to a different target. One aimed for the $500 million cracking unit that processed refined fuels for Moscow's military district. The other locked onto the storage tank, a behemoth holding tens of thousands of tons of crude oil. Western experts would later describe the moment as a dual strike on Russia's war chest, a precision attack designed not just to destroy infrastructure, but to send an unmistakable message. The first drone hit the Ilyusavt-6 with surgical precision. Its shaped charge detonated at 25,000 feet per second, punching a molten jet of copper through the steel casing. This wasn't a simple explosion, it was physics-based sabotage. The heat, exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, ignited internal components and pressure vessels, essentially cooking the unit from the inside out. As Defense News reported, such an impact was equivalent to disabling a city's entire power grid with a single strike. Exactly 1.3 seconds later, the second drone slammed into the storage tank. The shaped charge punctured its 20mm steel wall, igniting the vast reserves inside. The result was apocalyptic, a fireball that dwarfed the initial blast, shooting into the sky with such intensity that NASA satellites recorded the thermal bloom from orbit. Local Russian media described the night sky turning into a second sunrise. Independent analysts cited by Reuters later confirmed that 50% of the refinery's refining capacity was crippled instantly. The economic ripple effects were immediate. Within days, Russia's domestic fuel prices spiked by over 50%. By mid-September, Moscow, once an energy superpower, was humiliatingly forced to import gasoline from Belarus to stabilize supply. It was the single most damaging strike on Russian energy infrastructure since the start of the war, wrote the Financial Times. Western energy markets braced for volatility, while NATO strategists privately celebrated what they called a game-changing blow. Russian officials tried to spin the event. The Ministry of Defense claimed to have downed the majority of incoming drones, emphasizing the resilience of Ryazan's defenses. Yet satellite imagery from BBC Verify contradicted those statements, showing massive fire scars and plumes stretching for kilometers. Russian social media erupted with videos of black smoke towering above Ryazan, shared faster than Moscow's censors could delete them. But beyond the spectacle, the strike revealed something deeper. Russia's air defense architecture was vulnerable not to billion-dollar bombers, but to swarms of cheap, intelligent drones. NATO officials, speaking off the record to DW, noted that the event would force a complete rethink of air defense systems across Europe. The Trump administration's Pentagon confirmed shortly after that NATO would accelerate procurement of counter-drone technologies, from directed energy weapons to AI-powered jamming systems. For Ukraine, the Ryazan strike was both a military and symbolic victory. It demonstrated that Kyiv could reach deep into Russian territory and disrupt the very lifeline of its war economy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in an address carried by Al Jazeera, declared, "Every refinery burning in Russia brings us closer to peace on Ukrainian terms." The remark underscored Kyiv's intent to weaponize economic attrition as much as battlefield victories, but experts warned of escalation. A senior analyst at Military Watch magazine predicted that Russia might retaliate by targeting Ukraine's energy grid or by intensifying missile barrages on Kyiv. Wars of infrastructure are two-way streets, he noted. NATO capitals also feared that Moscow, desperate to protect its energy assets, might redeploy critical defenses away from front lines, ironically weakening Russian positions in Ukraine itself. As the inferno raged, one thing became clear: a $10,000 drone strike had inflicted billions in damage, rewriting the logic of cost and power in modern conflict. The Ryazan strike would become a case study in military academies across the globe, proof that the future of war belongs not to the biggest hammer, but to the sharpest nail. Yet amid the flames, questions loomed. How would Moscow respond? Would it double down on brute force or finally acknowledge the vulnerability of its billion-dollar defenses? And more crucially, could Ukraine replicate this success, or would Russia adapt before the next strike? The fireball over Ryazan was still visible from miles away when Russian commanders scrambled to craft a response. By dawn, state television declared victory, claiming the refinery was fully operational and that dozens of Ukrainian drones had been shot down. But satellite imagery and independent analysis told a starkly different story. The Ilyusv-AVT-6 cracking unit lay in ruins, and half the refinery's production was offline. Fuel shortages rippled through central Russia, queues formed at gas stations, and the Kremlin quietly ordered emergency imports from Belarus. Western outlets like Reuters and BBC Verify published high-resolution images showing the devastation undermining Moscow's narrative. For the Kremlin, the damage wasn't just material, it was psychological. Ryazan had been touted as one of Russia's most secure industrial facilities, wrapped in layers of defenses. Yet a handful of drones costing less than a new SUV had pierced its armor. As one DW military analyst quipped, "The world just witnessed a $10,000 David slay a $7 billion Goliath." Moscow's immediate reaction was predictably heavy-handed. Within days, 5 additional Pantsir S-1 batteries and 2 more Mi-28 helicopters were rushed to Ryazan. Engineers erected new radar arrays, and Spetsnaz patrols were doubled. But Western observers saw the futility. "It's like building taller fences to stop birds after a flood," remarked Defense News. The strike had exposed a fundamental imbalance. Russia's defenses were designed for large, expensive threats, not nimble swarms of cheap attackers. Meanwhile, Ukraine capitalized on the psychological victory. Officials in Kyiv framed the strike as proof that Moscow's war economy could be targeted directly. President Zelensky declared that every refinery and every depot that fuels the war is a legitimate target. NATO diplomats, though cautious, privately welcomed the strategy. For the West, the attack offered a blueprint for asymmetric warfare, crippling an adversary's economy without committing vast arsenals of conventional firepower. Economic analysts highlighted the cascading effects. By mid-September, Russian fuel exports dropped by nearly 20%, cutting into hard currency earnings that sustained the war effort. Domestic fuel prices rose by 54%, sparking discontent even in regions far from the front lines. According to the Financial Times, Moscow had to divert at least $3 billion in emergency funds, to stabilize the market money that might otherwise have supplied troops in Ukraine. Under President Donald Trump, the United States maintained its stance of avoiding direct intervention, but Washington was not silent. A Pentagon spokesperson quoted by the New York Times noted that Russia is discovering the vulnerability of its energy backbone. While officially neutral NATO nations increased shipments of counter-drone systems to Ukraine, ensuring Kyiv could replicate the Ryazan model elsewhere. The global reverberations were just as significant. Energy markets fluctuated as traders priced in the risk of further Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries. Brent crude briefly spiked 7% in the week after the attack, reminding the world that the Ukraine war could destabilize global supply chains at any moment. European capitals, already strained by inflation, prepared contingency reserves in case of a broader energy shock. But Moscow was not about to let the humiliation stand. Russian military planners reportedly discussed new strategies, including redeploying advanced defenses from border regions to critical energy hubs. That raised another problem: stripping defenses from the battlefield could expose frontline troops in Ukraine to more HIMARS strikes and drone raids. It was as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe described a shell game Russia cannot afford to play forever. Inside Russia, the propaganda machine strained to cover the cracks. Television anchors insisted the strike had been exaggerated by Western media, but on the ground, citizens filmed endless gas lines, posting them to social media before censors could delete them. Leaked reports suggested the Kremlin feared public anger more than NATO, as ordinary Russians began to question how a supposedly invincible fortress could be brought to its knees by children's toys. For Ukraine, the strike marked not just a tactical victory, but a strategic turning point. Military historian Philip Ingram, writing in The Independent, compared it to Britain's World War II dambusters raid. Symbolically, it shows the enemy can be hit where he feels strongest. That has psychological value far beyond the battlefield. Kyiv had demonstrated that distance and fortifications were no shield when innovation and intelligence were applied ruthlessly. Yet the question hung heavy. How would Russia retaliate? Analysts feared an escalation in missile attacks against Ukraine's energy grid, potentially plunging cities into darkness ahead of winter. Others worried Moscow might intensify strikes on NATO's intelligence assets in Eastern Europe, risking direct confrontation. What was undeniable was the shift in momentum. A single night strike had forced Moscow onto the defensive economically, militarily, and politically. The war of attrition was evolving into a war of infrastructure, and Ukraine had just shown it could play that game on equal terms. The inferno at Ryazan left more than just scorched steel, it left Russia at a crossroads. For decades, Moscow had relied on its energy empire as both a weapon and a shield, projecting power through oil exports and financing military campaigns. But the Ukrainian strike proved that this backbone was not invulnerable. With half the refinery's capacity crippled and fuel imports from Belarus now propping up supply, the world saw a Russia forced into defensive measures it had once ridiculed others for. Western analysts framed the event as a turning point. Reuters described the strike as the most significant breach of Russia's economic armor since the war began. Meanwhile, BBC Verify confirmed that the refinery's outages alone amounted to 17% of Russia's national refining capacity. The strategic fallout was immense. Domestic fuel prices skyrocketed, exports were slashed, and billions were siphoned away from frontline operations into emergency stabilization efforts. Under President Donald Trump, the United States maintained a cautious tone. Official statements emphasized Washington's desire to avoid direct confrontation while reaffirming support for Ukraine's defense. Yet behind closed doors, NATO officials viewed Ryazan as a case study. According to Defense News, alliance planners saw proof that drones costing thousands can dismantle billion-dollar assets, a revelation that will shape NATO's procurement for years. Several capitals, including Berlin and Warsaw, immediately announced accelerated programs for counter-drone defenses and investment in electronic warfare. For Ukraine, Ryazan was more than a tactical success. It was a proof of concept. Kiev's military strategists recognized that energy infrastructure strikes could inflict economic attrition without matching Russia tank for tank or missile for missile. Already reports from Al Jazeera suggested that new targets were being scouted: refineries in Samara, fuel depots in Rostov, and even export terminals along the Black Sea. The psychological effect was just as potent as the physical damage. Russia's elites, once certain of their security, now feared every refinery could be next. The Kremlin's answer, predictably, was brute reinforcement. Within weeks, new Pantsir S-1 batteries and S-400 units were deployed to protect strategic energy sites. But Western experts dismissed the measures as insufficient. Russia is plugging leaks with gold-plated corks, a DW defense analyst remarked. But the flood is coming faster than they can react. The paradox was clear: every system moved to guard energy assets left fewer defenses for frontline troops in Ukraine, creating vulnerabilities NATO and Kiev could exploit. Global markets shuddered in response. Oil prices spiked not because of a supply collapse but because of uncertainty. Traders feared a campaign of systematic strikes could ripple far beyond Russia, destabilizing energy flows into Europe and Asia. By late September, Brent crude had risen 7% compared to pre-strike levels, underscoring how a single Ukrainian drone raid could send shockwaves across the globe. For ordinary Russians, the aftermath was humiliating. Long queues at gas stations, sudden price surges, and visible plumes of smoke shattered the illusion of control. State media insisted the situation was under control, yet leaked documents suggested Moscow spent over $3 billion in emergency measures in the first 2 weeks after the strike. Discontent brewed quietly in regions far from Moscow, where fuel shortages bit hardest. Military historians quickly compared Ryazan to historic raids that reshaped wars. Just as the dambusters crippled Nazi industry in 1943, Ukraine's drones demonstrated the power of precision economic warfare in the 21st century. The lesson, wrote Philip Ingram in The Independent, is that victory may not be won in trenches or skies alone, but in targeting the arteries of an enemy's economy. Yet escalation loomed. Experts at Military Watch magazine warned that Russia could retaliate by intensifying strikes against Ukraine's power grid, plunging cities into blackouts during winter. Others speculated that Moscow might lash out at NATO reconnaissance assets, raising the risk of direct confrontation. The war had entered a dangerous new phase where infrastructure, not just soldiers, was the primary target. Still, one reality was undeniable: Ryazan had redrawn the battlefield map. Cheap drones had forced a superpower into reactive defense, shaken global markets, and exposed NATO to new strategic lessons. For Ukraine, it was both a victory and a gamble, one that might invite harsher retaliation, but also one that proved innovation can bend the balance of power.